Welcome to everyone to Parent Up Pittsburgh. For those of you who may not have attended a Parent Up session before, the intent behind this is really to power up your parenting skills. Parenting is really hard, and it seems like it gets harder every year. The topics that kids have to address get more and more complex, and they're having to confront some of these things at a younger and younger age. And so we know that parents sometimes feel a little bit helpless or just aren't sure where the path forward is. And we have access to such amazing expertise throughout our region that we developed Parent Up to serve as a resource for some of those complicated issues. And so please do keep your eyes open for ongoing topics throughout the year. We're very excited today to be talking about having hard conversations, discussing gun and community violence with your children. And to have that conversation with us, I'm really excited to welcome Dr. Amy Tiberi. She is a licensed psychologist and certified school psychologist, currently employed at UPMC Children's Hospital of Pittsburgh, working as an embedded provider within the Division of Hematology, Oncology, and BMT with an emphasis in hematology. Dr. Amy has extensive experience in trauma-informed practices and working with youth who have complex psychosocial situations. She's passionate about working with underserved and marginalized groups and is involved in advocacy and research with improving access to care for those populations. Prior to joining UPMC, Dr. Tiberi has worked in a variety of settings, including residential treatment facilities, outpatient mental health, partial hospitalization, juvenile detention centers, and public schools. So before I turn it over to Dr. Amy, I do want to just say thank you to NAMI. They have been a sponsor for us really since the beginning and have made it possible for us to bring all of this information to all of you at no cost. So thanks to NAMI. But with that, Amy, thank you so much for being here. Go ahead and take it away.
Thank you so much for the great introduction. I appreciate it. I think Jamie's going to run my PowerPoint for me, so I think she's just going to switch it over for me.
Just give me 1 second.
You're good. So I think we already got the great introduction from Laura, but as she said, title of tonight's presentation, Having Hard Conversations, Discussing Gun and Community Violence with Your Children. So some topics to cover tonight, and I think before we even go over these, I want to keep in mind, like, this is a small group. I want this to be conversational in nature. So please, at any point in time, if any of you have questions or kind of want me to expand further on certain topics, just stop me, pause me, and we can make this more of a conversation, because I do think that's one of the best ways to learn. So topics tonight to cover, a review of statistics really quickly, and then some parenting skills. So how to approach conversations, fears about safety that we commonly see in children, behavior changes that we see, what parents and caregivers can do, and then when to seek out professional help. Let's start with just talking about, like, what is community violence. I think we talk about violence a lot. I think we hear about it a ton in the media. Sometimes it's nice to define it and look at what we're actually talking about in the context of this conversation. So the National Center for Traumatic Stress Network defines community violence as exposure to intentional acts of interpersonal violence committed in public areas by individuals who are not intimately related to the victim. I think when you look at this definition, it's something that we all probably can relate to, and something we all can link back to experiences maybe that we've witnessed or experiences that we've seen secondhand through media or other sources. Community violence can be individual or group in nature, so that can include bullying, that can include gang violence, that can include violence in our community, whether it be in the streets, in schools, or in other community settings. I think even within Pittsburgh, the violence that happened in Squirrel Hill a few years ago is a great example, something that really affected our entire community. Even if we weren't directly witnesses to it, it was an area that we all are familiar with. It's people who we know who might attend those synagogues, and it's kind of impacted everybody in a ripple effect. Could be community violence in the sense of shootings in public areas, so schools, malls, etc. A few years ago, there was that Ross Park shooting at the Ross Park Mall, smaller in scale, but again, like something that people were there for. You might have known somebody who was there or somebody who witnessed it, and a great example of community violence right in our Pittsburgh lens. And then warlike conditions in the United States. And I think this really zooms out bigger on more of a national scale, but thinking about like the border and immigration issues that we've seen recently in the media, and other kinds of similar conditions on other parts of the country. The statistics around community violence probably aren't a shock to anyone. I think this is something that we see a lot, and I think the media talks about it a lot, that mass shootings are increasing and that there's more gun violence related deaths. So I just wanted to pull these charts just for us to look at them by the numbers. This first one just talks about gun violence related deaths by year, and you can see that steady uptick. And then again, if you look at rise in mass shootings, the graph on the right was pulled in July of 2022. And if you look at the number 320 mass shootings as of July 2022, it's pretty staggering compared to what the numbers were like less than 10 years ago. So halfway through a year, we've like already maxed out what like 2014 and almost 2015's numbers were. So we're seeing more of this. And I think children especially, I think, are growing up in an era where it happens commonly, right? There were periods of time a few months ago where there was more than one happening in a month. And it's something that we are unfortunately becoming familiar with. And I think as this is something that is happening in our community, finding how to be familiar with conversations surrounding it could be really critical, important. So I think let's talk for a minute, and this can be brief, and maybe this is even just more of a thinking point. But I think before you talk about how to talk with your children about community violence, it's important to first ask ourselves, where do you get information about violence in your community or across the country? Because I think as we're approaching conversations with children about this, we need to know what is our information source and how are we approaching the conversations. Anybody have like immediate thoughts of where they consume this kind of information on a day-to-day basis or even like weekly basis?
Well, I would think, kids would get it from each other, like, and on social media.
Right. I think social media is a huge one, right?
Yeah. I don't, who watches the news anymore? It's all.
Exactly. Yeah.
I know for me though, like I got a lot of exposure about local violence at work exposure. Yeah. So
yeah, I think social media and what I think is interesting, or maybe is different than it was 10 years ago. As you mentioned, nobody really watches the news per se, but we all get those alerts on our phone. So I tend to get snippets, and then I get the detail sometimes from social media, a lot on Twitter. Community violence in our area or in my neighborhood, I get some of that information from the neighborhood chat groups, not the, I can't remember what the one is that's terrible, but each, like there's a I live in Mount Washington, there's a Mount Washington community group where people will share, like, I heard sirens, or what's happening at this location, and then someone will fill them in. And so that's how it's always very instant and not with a lot of analysis.
Yeah, I think those small local, like small scale ones especially, are things that we see in those Facebook groups, on social media, like on people's Instagram stories. And it might not be, like you said, very data driven, but more informally through conversation. Go ahead and click. Yeah, there you go. So how to approach conversations. I think keeping conversations and keeping in mind, like, we're all human, right? I think that's the best way to approach this. But what I recommend to most of the families that I work with is conversations are had best with trusted caregivers, right? I would assume that if we're on this call, we're identifying ourselves as trusted caregivers in some sort with kids. And if we're taking the time to invest in how to have these conversations, we're invested in likely being a trusted caregiver to have these conversations with our children. I think the big takeaway is children learn by observation, right? Children model adults. People learn through interaction. So when we're approaching these conversations, we know that often they're emotionally loaded in nature. They're topics that can be emotional. They're topics that can really have a lot of valence to them, and they can be unpredictable, right? Because just like we are getting data and information about community violence from a variety of sources, depending on the age of our kids, they also can have lots of information maybe that we haven't heard, or different information than we've heard because they're at school or on the bus or at an extracurricular activity. When we're approaching these conversations, I think the big takeaway on observation is being mindful of your emotional responses, modeling how you would want your children to respond to future conversations about violence, modeling how you express emotions, modeling even the tone of your voice, the amount of emotion you show. Not that showing emotion is bad or unwanted, more so modeling appropriate ways to manage when the conversations do get difficult. If it is a very emotionally taxing event, right? Like, especially thinking like outside of our local community, like our larger communities on like national level, right? These like big school shootings or 9/11 just passed, right? So God forbid something like that were to happen again, but big events, right? That really like affect us from very emotionally because of the magnitude of them. Waiting to have the conversation until you're emotionally ready. And I think checking in with yourself first and recognizing, is this a time where I really feel confident in my ability to manage a conversation that could get difficult, or where children could ask questions, or would I prefer to wait until tomorrow morning, tomorrow evening, whatever it might be. I would always say deliver facts first. So lead with what you know, lead with facts to kind of provide a sense of foundation. We think about and kind of like reflect as ourselves as adults, we probably feel best like if your boss approaches you for a meeting and says like, hey, I want to meet with you about something. When you go into that meeting, the first thing you want to know is like, why are you meeting with me, right? Like, what's the reason for this meeting? I think thinking about that in terms of having conversations with your kids is a good way to approach it. So go in with facts first and deliver what we know, and then you can work through the emotional parts. And remember, you know your child best. So decide how much information to give based on age and their developmental level and the amount of awareness that you think that they might have or know that they might have, given like what social media outlets do they have access to. Are they on TikTok? Are they on Instagram? Things like that. So when we prepare for conversations, I started on this a little bit, but after an event happens, as a parent, say to yourself, where do I stand on this emotionally? So is this something that I'm very emotionally invested in and feel impacted by emotionally? Or is it something that I feel pretty steady on and I feel confident and capable of managing at this time? If it is something impacting us emotionally, do we have another partner or a co-parent who might be able to help with the conversation? Do we have a like group that we are involved in where there might be like the opportunity for a group conversation? Is this something that we know school is going to address if it was the type of violence that was addressed at school? Kind of triaging it for yourself as a parent and a caregiver who might be approaching the conversation. And then ask ourselves, like, do I feel comfortable with the facts? Am I actually sure of what happened? Or did I just like read that headline, right? And I don't really know what happened beyond the headline that popped up on my like push notification on my phone, or what I read on the 55 word Twitter, right? So kind of identifying how much do we know about it? And then have I seen on social media what my child might have seen if appropriate, right? So I think that's always a good point of context. Like if our kids are on social media, we should also be kind of monitoring that. If there are posts that they've likely seen, we want to at least know what they may have seen before we're going into the conversation. I kind of broke this down from developmental level, and I wanted to start early, even though I know probably a lot of us are dealing with more of kids on the upper edge of the spectrum, but early elementary, it all kind of builds on itself anyway. So when we're approaching conversations with early elementary children, those kindergarten, first, second grade children, I think keep it brief, right? Share important details and facts, share what they need to know, not everything that is known. Pair it with lots of reassurance and pair with emotional support and validity. Remind them of the adult's role to protect. So remind them why you're there and then why there are other adults that are around to protect them. I think building along that, creating examples of safety. So what are protocols that are already in place? We lock the doors at our home. We have security cameras. Maybe we have at school, our doors lock automatically. At school, you can't get picked up unless this parent has, unless you're a ride or your parent has a tag, right? Or different measures, whatever they might be, whether they're in the community, whether they're at school, whether they're at an organization, that are part of their everyday routine that maybe children don't even know are safety measures. They more so just recognize them as routine. Then at the bottom here, I have an example of like how a blanket explanation that could be a good lead in, right? So something bad happened. I want you to feel that you can ask me questions, right? So keeping it brief. And then maybe they have questions, maybe they don't have questions, maybe they know, maybe they don't know. From there, you can kind of build on that and model what you want to talk about in the conversation. Late elementary and middle school explanations are going to become a little more mature because children are maturing. But children are probably going to ask you follow-up questions. In early elementary, we wouldn't expect kids from a developmental level to really ask a lot of questions. But as we're getting into that late elementary or middle school level, there's more comprehension, there's more awareness of society and the world around them. Kids are going to ask, right? And they probably have had more interactions with peers and more conversations with peers, whether it be at activities or at school or even in the neighborhood. So I think answering questions honestly and reminding ourselves as parents that it's okay not to have exact answers is the most important part. I always say it's okay to say, I'm going to look into that and come back and we'll have a bit more conversation on that. It's totally okay to say, like, I'm not sure, let me find out, or I'm going to look into that. I'm going to call school. I'm going to call so-and-so and see what we can do to get those answers for you. I think be prepared to help separate reality from fantasy and imagination. This is something that is really big in this age range, especially that like late elementary school age where we're very into like fantasy and fiction and role playing, imaginative play, lots of like I always like relate it to like superheroes and Marvels, right? Like very much into that action-packed lifestyle. I think it can be very quick and easy when we watch Marvel movies or action movies or fantasy movies to see violent acts that might be similar to things that are happening in our community, even when it comes to like physical violence that might happen in the community, and kind of justify it in that lens of fiction, whether it be in movies, whether it be on YouTube, whether it be on video games that we play. So I think being able to kind of tease that apart and help kids say like, hey, I know in movies or in video games, you might see this, but when we're interacting with people, right? Like we don't hit people, we don't punch people, we don't hurt people because of the way they look or because of how XYZ, right? Whatever the violent act might have been. And I think building on that, discussing tools and practices, again, just like in the early elementary age, that your family takes to keep you safe and why we take these measures to keep safe. A good lead-in for conversation with this age range, I would say, is like leading with more of a question, asking that, what have you heard about what has happened? And kind of letting them take a little bit more of the lead, given that we know that they are exposed a little bit more. And then high school explanations, I always say let's lead in with asking what they've heard, right? These are those kids that we know probably are linked into social media to a certain extent. We hear conversations through friends, classmates, etc. Share concrete suggestions on how to help. And maybe this is how to help on a family level. Maybe this is how we can help in our community, what we can do to give back or support. work together to review safety guidelines, asking what would make you feel more safe, what are things that you feel like could improve at school, in our organizations, in the community. And then I think processing a little bit deeper about like, what are your concerns about safety? What are your worries? What are your day-to-day fears surrounding community violence? Have you experienced things that are really impacting you? And then I think pairing that with validation, like I really appreciate you having these conversations with me. I know it's not easy to discuss these kinds of things. It must be really scary to know that these kinds of things happen in the community. Like, I'm glad you feel safe talking to me about these. And I think a lead in for this age range is that, what are your thoughts on what happened today, yesterday, this week, whenever it might have been? Some other notes surrounding this topic. I think it's always important as a family to make decisions surrounding media consumption about events. If we are a news watching family, which I know this isn't really the era of watching news as much, but are we limiting watching news? Are we limiting like the sources that we access on social media? How much are we monitoring social media if kids are using it? Are we allowing TikTok, things like that? And then I think the big thing that a lot of parents can always improve on is being aware of adult conversations that you're having near or around kids. Kids are listening ears that are always around. And I think it's easy to slip into conversations, especially about current events, when you get those notifications, when you're on social media, when you're getting information in real time, because we live in a digital society. And remembering that if we're having those conversations in real time, that there might be others listening, and that's fine, but just being prepared for what that might bring, right, in terms of conversation with our kids. And I think the biggest thing is creating that safe space for continuing conversation. A lot of these conversations aren't one day conversations, right? They're not a sit down and never have the conversation again. It's more of setting foundation and revisiting the conversation over and over to ensure safety and ensure comfort on these topics. Fears about safety are a very common theme that we see when we're talking about community violence with children. I think especially with adolescents and young adults, we see a lot of worry about another event occurring. And honestly, I don't think that I blame kids for worrying about another event occurring when we see the frequency of events that are happening in the United States, right? It's something that happens all the time, depending on where these kids are living, what kinds of schools they're going to. Maybe they are exposed to things regularly at school, on the streets, in the communities. And I think a lot of times questions about practices in place or comfort is a source of concern, right? So like, school is supposed to be a place where I feel safe to go. Like, this is supposed to be a place where I feel safe to go learn. It's supposed to be somewhere where I'm not like at risk, but things happen at schools, right? So how do we ensure safety and fear surrounding our safety at school? At home, like if we live in communities of violence or communities where there's more like gunshots or where families are exposed to certain things, there are kids who worry about safety on a daily basis, right? So how do we help to resolve those concerns or those fears the best of our ability, right? And then community locations, right? Like, are there certain places in the community on our way to bus stops, on our way to different locations that are uncomfortable, right? Or they feel unsafe walking through them? How can we work through that? And I think we see a lot of asking what if questions, right? So that forward thinking, like after events have happened, after kids have been exposed to certain things, thinking ahead and saying like, what if blank happens when I go to school next year? Or what if blank happens again, right? Or what if there's another shooting and down the street? Or what if somebody dies in a car accident again, whatever it might be, right? And kind of like coming back to those kinds of questions and linking to those fears about safety ongoing. I think linked with fears of safety, when kids have been exposed to community violence, whether it be gun violence, whether it be other kinds of violence, and there's this ongoing, right, like conversation or just exposure in the sense of where kids are located, we can see changes in behaviors. changes in behaviors can be on a spectrum, just like anything else, right? So some are very mild in nature, and maybe it takes months for them to be noticed by caregivers or parents. Not because they're not aware, just because they're so minute and small that it takes a long time for attention to really shift to it because the changes happen so minusculely. Some common examples of behavior changes that we see when there really is this recurrent community violence is an increase in activity level. So becoming more hyperactive, feeling like they have more energy, feeling like they are like out of control and that they just like can't slow their bodies down. Along with that, an increase in irritability or anger. So maybe we're seeing like more outbursts, whether this is more outbursts at school, whether this is more outbursts at home, maybe like different kinds of outbursts. I always say like short fusing, right? So if before we weren't kids who were short fused and really like quick 0 to 100, but suddenly we are short fusing and like moving from a 0 to 100 really quickly, that's kind of like a flag of like, okay, this is something to note. And maybe it's something that is just a one-time thing or a thing that is happening because there's a stressor happening at school or at home. But if it's something that we're really noticing a shift in behavior that's happening for more than like a week or two at a time, then that's something to note in terms of a change. Changes in attention or concentration, noticing that there's reports of trouble focusing at school, noticing that there's trouble with attention to tasks. Maybe at home we're noticing like giving a task or a chore and we're not attending to it as closely. Maybe we like have to continually prompt them to like take their laundry to their room. Maybe we have to prompt them to like, can you put the dishes in the dishwasher, please? And then returning to that same prompt and task. I think another big one is changes in attitude about the future, right? So increases feelings of hopelessness, feeling like the world's a bad place. You hear these like statements of like the world's never going to get better. Like I don't see a point in like doing this anymore. Like no matter what we do, there's still gun violence or there's still violence at school. My school's not safe. Seeing those kinds of shifts in attitude that we haven't seen historically. Changes in sleep or appetite are big ones when it comes to traumatic exposures to violence. So we see a lot of decreased sleep. So trouble, especially with trouble onset with sleep. So commonly we see kids struggling to fall asleep and then struggling once they fall asleep to stay asleep. So they'll say, I get in bed, I struggle to fall asleep. It takes me an hour or two to fall asleep. Then once I fall asleep, I wake up several times throughout the night. And then if you follow up and you are noticing like they're saying they're not feeling well rested in the morning, right? That's a sign that when we are sleeping, we're not getting good quality sleep. So our brain isn't slowing down enough and it's in this fight or flight response enough or too much when we're sleeping and not able to fully relax and get that restorative sleep that we need. Along with that, we see both sides of the spectrum in terms of appetite and food intake, but we either see limited food intake, so restricted eating, or we see more like binge eating. Both are emotional responses and like appropriate responses in a sense to coping with traumatic events. But if it's something that we see for long periods of time that is impacting like weight, if we're noticing fluctuation in weight or noticing it impacting fuel and like them feeling able to move through day-to-day tasks because of the restriction or the binging, then that's also something to make note of. And then I think a big one is lack of interest in usual activities. Are we not wanting to engage in activities that we normally or historically have engaged in? Are we avoiding activities that we've engaged in? Are we withdrawing from activities, not wanting to spend time with friends, not wanting to do sports or other extracurriculars? Those are all like notable shifts that we would want to make note of. We also notice physical complaints, really common ones, especially with trauma exposure, aches, pains, headaches, kind of those like, I have a stomach ache, like I can't do anything. I feel like I can't go to school. I feel like I can't go to activities. Focus on the violent events. So like continually bringing up topics surrounding this conversation. Increased sound sensitivity. We see this a lot with kids who have been exposed to gun violence specifically, but also to like bombing or other things that they've actually heard the sounds of violence. We see that then translate and kind of generalize to other sounds as well. So like being stadiums, being at baseball parks, being at amusement parks, things where there's loud, those high frequency loud noises, we see that increased sound sensitivity. And then strong reactions to reminders of the attack. So if we're seeing people associated with the attack, if we're seeing social media posts, having nightmares, seeing police, all of these are certain kind of triggers, or how we refer to them, that might remind kids of the attack, and that can lead to particularly strong reactions. Reactions can vary. Some kids react with angry outbursts, some kids withdraw, some kids become very like tearful or anxious. It varies greatly, but it's very common to see those strong reactions when there are specific reminders of attacks prompted. There are also kind of more specifically trauma and PTSD symptoms that are more like diagnostic in nature. So from a psychology perspective, these are symptoms that we really look for. When we talk about PTSD, these are symptoms that we need to see for multiple months at a time, right? So consistently seeing for longer periods of time. I think it's common to see some of those behavior changes that I spoke of for short periods of time immediately following an attack. But when we talk about trauma and PTSD symptoms, we're talking about prolonged symptoms and symptoms that really are impacting functioning on a day-to-day basis. So I think if we're talking about PTSD symptoms, we're talking about symptoms for a child who is exposed directly to violence or a victim of violence. If we have kids that have been in these situations, there are some symptoms in particular that we really want to kind of have a pulse on. So these are shifts in sleep patterns, experiencing nightmares, experiencing flashbacks, which can be in the form of nightmares, or they can be during the day as well. Again, thoughts centering around the event. So just revisiting the event and with thoughts, no matter what we're doing, right? So almost in situations that you wouldn't feel are appropriate to revisit the thoughts. Trouble focusing, inattention, hyperactivity, different from baseline. Changes in academic performance. Most of the time we see a decrease in academic performance and a decrease in like completion of assignments, and then large feelings of sadness or grief. These symptoms we have to see usually from between 3 to 6 months, 6 months for sure, but at least 3 months to start talking about them from like a post-traumatic kind of lens. So I think taking a step further is like signs of trauma that we need more urgent intervention. And I think all of these topics, my intent in talking about the behavior changes and about the signs and symptoms of diagnostic is, I think as parents, you're the ones with your kids on a day-to-day basis. You have teachers at school, you have community leaders, maybe there's counselors or therapists that your kids interface with, but you're the ones with them on a day-to-day basis. So I think having awareness of this information helps you to, one, set the foundation, and two, to approach conversations and say, like, if you are experiencing these things, let's talk about it, right? Because then that can really set you up for more conversations, better evaluating, and better supporting your kids ultimately. These specific signs and symptoms are ones that might require more urgent intervention, right? So safety concerns, if we're threatening to harm ourselves or harm others, having panic attacks. So panic attacks where we're having trouble breathing, having trouble focusing, maybe we're experiencing physical symptoms of anxiety, paranoia, seeing things, hearing voices. These are all things that are kind of red flags and are like, let's make an appointment with a mental health provider as soon as possible, right? Hopefully we're not experiencing these things, but if we are, I think these are signs that there's something going on here, whether it's trauma, whether it's anxiety surrounding a violent event that we've been exposed to. And these are all times that maybe we should seek additional support outside of the parental supports that you've already built in. So I think, what can you do as parents and caregivers to help? So spending time talking, using those skills that we talked about earlier, setting the stage for how you want to talk about these things, and really providing validation for them that the more we talk about this, the more we can normalize coping with these difficult events and coping with the strong emotions that come with these events is okay. I think our society is shifting, right? That we're welcoming emotions and we're welcoming conversation about difficult topics more than we have. And I think this is happening because parents are more willing to approach these conversations and more willing to take on the task of having them, even though they can be really hard to do at times. Promoting self-care is a huge one that I think is it feels very like duh, obviously, but it can be huge in terms of the impact that it has, right? So what are healthy habits that your child has? And then what are healthy habits that can be integrated into part of the daily routine, right? So when we experience a violent event, when we experience a traumatic event, this can shift our routine. It can make us withdraw from things that we normally engage in. It can make us change our routine, maybe to help us feel more safe or to make us feel like we're in control of certain things. But in reality, one of the best things that we can do is promoting self-care. And sometimes that means continuing to do things that we've always done that make us feel like ourselves and make us feel good. So maybe that means continuing to go to school, even if going to school is a little scary, because we know school is a safe place. School is a place that has safety precautions in place. If there's something that comes up at school, there are these people that we can reach out to. Same with events and activities, right? And this isn't forcing our kids to engage in activities or forcing our kids to do certain things. This is like helping to support them to continue to engage in activities that help them to thrive and feel like themselves. I think when we're talking self-care, other like domains, it's like emotionally, how are we taking care of ourselves? So maybe it's like we're having a weekly family conversation about like things that happened this week that just kind of like hit us hard. Or maybe it's checking in with our friends, right? And like on the bus, just being like, how was your day? I do with my patients a lot, like peaks and pits, right? So like, what was your peak of your day? What was your pit of the day? And like every time I see my kids, it's like, we're starting out this way. What was your peak? What was the pit? And just like having those little check-ins, they don't have to be long, but like noticing like the highs and the lows of the day and how they can vary day to day. And then maintaining expectations or rules and creating that consistency. I think when there's violence or when there are big events that occur, it can be really easy to stray from the norm, kind of like what I was just saying. Kids, and I mean, honestly, adults as well, if I'm speaking from personal experience, do best when we have expectations and boundaries and rules, right? And I think when there are times of uncertainty, when there are times where our safety is at risk or where we're feeling unsafe, the best thing we can do is continue to use expectations and rules to really help our kids thrive. I think, again, kind of going along with expectations is addressing acting out behaviors as a sign of strong emotions. So kind of hitting it head on and saying like, hey, I've noticed that you've kind of been short fusing lately, or I've noticed you've been getting really angry when we talk about this. Is this something that's making you angry because of what happened last week? Or is it something that you're fearful of? Are you worried about something? Like, let's talk about what's happening. Again, like we've already talked about, setting limits for media and TV exposure. So kind of setting expectations about like what is healthy, right? And I think that's very much based on individual families and preference, but recognizing that phones are an endless source of data and news and all kinds of things. And the more we're exposed to it, the more potentially anxiety or worry could be stemming from it, especially if we have a very like closely tied event that has happened near our community. Helping our kids feel safe. So I think discussing drills or practices that take place, discussing practices at home. I think a lot of kids that I've worked with, especially ones who have experienced trauma directly, is kind of coming up with like home safety plans of like what makes me feel safe at home, right? Like what are my action items that I do when certain things happen that make me feel unsafe? Like where are places that I go that give me emotional safety? Like where are places that I need to go to sit if I need a quiet place to calm down? What are things that my mom or my dad or whoever it might be can do to help me in those moments? So an example, like child says, like, what if a person comes into my school? Parent can respond with, well, here are things your school can do to help you keep safe. And I think from a school perspective, schools should be able to provide resources to parents surrounding like what the school's protocols are, whether it be like active shooters, whether it's fire, whether it's like tornado drills, whatever it is, right? Like if there's drills, they should have evacuation plans or certain protocols in place, and there should be some kind of conversations happening at school, but you also should be able to continue those conversations at home if that would help to support your children. So when to seek out professional help. So I think those shifts in behavior that we talked about, the behavior changes that we can see, if we're noticing those for more than like a week, right? Like a couple of days, a week, 2 weeks. Okay, that's something that we're noticing. It's probably normative adjustment given what's gone on. But if it's something we're seeing for prolonged periods of time, maybe it's time we get a professional involved. Changes in sleep, like we discussed. Children and adolescents, if they're asking to speak to therapists or counselors. I think adolescents and teenagers are pretty cool right now, and that they are so much more open to mental health, and they are so willing to talk about things that, like, at least when I was growing up, like, weren't things that we talked about and like weren't as open. And I think a lot of teens are now saying, like, I want to talk to a psychologist, right? And parents are like, oh, I had no idea that you wanted that, right? So if they're asking, I think that's a huge sign to us as parents and caregivers to kind of like take their lead and help to support them. And then I think the other big one is like I said early on, like, you're the parents, you know your child best, you know their developmental needs. If you notice concerns, follow your instinct as a parent and help to link them to services. So there's so many different professionals to access. There's school-based providers, psychologists, counselors, social workers at school. There's so many community organizations that are amazing. Local centers for child and adolescent treatment. Pediatricians' offices here in Pittsburgh, we are like very, very fortunate to have pediatricians' offices that have behavioral health providers linked into many of them through Children's Community Pediatrics. And there's so many wonderful organizations, like I said, that are also very closely linked to the pediatricians' offices that can provide in-house services there as well. There are just a few additional resources on the topic. The National Child Traumatic Stress Network has so many great resources. And there are also just a few treatment options. I think in Pittsburgh, especially for trauma, there's a treatment for trauma in child and adolescents down through Allegheny Health Network. That's amazing. So yeah. We'll open the floor up for questions or anything else that you guys would like to discuss.
Amy, thank you so much. I do have just a couple of maybe trend questions that, as you were talking, as parents or caregivers, do you see a pattern or a trend of kids almost being less upset or less flustered when community violence occurs than the parents are? And I guess some of the kids in my life have regular active shooter drills. And it's sort of, when I was in school, I grew up in Illinois, so we had tornado drills. And so when we would have tornado drills, we were always very matter of fact about it. It wasn't something that was particularly alarming or concerning. And I know, kids now are having these active shooter drills. Sometimes the drills are more alarming for parents and caregivers. So is that something to be concerned about? Should parents be educating themselves a little bit more? Is that, is it a good thing that kids are sort of, absorbing this escalation of community violence or risk?
I think that's a great point. And I think my response to that is, I think additional conversations need to be had, because I think it's like almost a sense of disconnect surrounding like this is a drill, but then when scary things happen, it doesn't mean we're any less scared, right? So we might feel confident and we might be really familiar with like active shooter drills and we talk about it all the time, but then when a big scary event happens, we don't have those skills to cope in the same way. And I think that's where parents really can be involved, and not to like scare our kids and not to like set them up for fear, but I think like when something does happen, having the appropriate emotional conversations to kind of like cope through, like, this is why those drills are there, right?
And so that brings up another question that I have. I think, again, going back to the tornado drills, we had to assume the position under our desks, which if we took a hit from a tornado, frankly, was not going to do a whole lot to help us out. Right. And I think, similarly, when we're talking about active shooter drills, not to disregard the importance of that and having that practice. But I wonder how can parents address it when you see things like Uvalde, where they were having active shooter drills,
right,
and there were just so many failures across the board, right? And so many adults who were unable to keep kids safe. That, you know, how do we help our kids not lose faith in adults and lose faith in schools when they see that and they think, well, now you're telling me my school's safe, but their parents were telling them too, you know?
Right. Yeah. So I think that is where I think twofold. The first fold is, I think, knowing what we know as adults and what our kids know, depending on their age and their level of access. And I think that's where it's scary being the adult of children or parent of children on media, right? Or having access to the internet, because there are things on the internet that we can access that might not necessarily be great for like a 10-year-old or a 12-year-old or whatever it might be to see, right? And I think that's a perfect example. And what I would say is that's where I always say, like, where are the calls to action, right? Because the reality is, it's like, yeah, that's really scary that happened, and that there were things in place, but these kids still were not able to be protected by the adults that were at their school. What would help us? We don't know, right? Because we might not ever be in a situation that was exactly like, or is exactly like that situation. We might never need to use our active shooter drills. And I think reframing it in that, like, there are a lot of unknowns, but like focusing on what we can't control. So I always say, like, let's focus on the controllable, and like the uncontrollables we kind of have to set by the wayside, right? And I think this gun violence, community violence in general, can become really overwhelming if we focus on all the uncontrollables, because it's a largely uncontrollable thing, right? We can't like set ourselves up for success in it, because we don't know what's going to happen. We don't know when it's going to happen. And then we don't really know how we're going to react until we're in the middle of it, having to react. And that's the difficult part, is we don't have answers. We have like things that we can do to practice, and we have things that we can do to keep safe, and we have conversations that we can have. And I think that's where setting these foundations at home and really like setting the groundwork to have the conversations, so where kids can approach us and really connect with us surrounding what they need, might be the best approach.
Great. I can certainly ask some more questions, but I want to open it up to if anyone else has questions that you would like to bring up. Go ahead, Jamie. You look like you were about to ask a question.
I was. So
I could tell from the heart.
You can tell from the
curious.
heart. I have a little one. I have a 5-year-old who just entered kindergarten. And I have to tell you, one of the processes in choosing what school he was going to go to was how small it was and the security measures. And I don't think I could have found a more obscure school for him to go to, because I am so frightened of what may happen. And so what tips do you have for parents who are petrified of what can happen to their kids at school, let alone to have this conversation? Like my child, we watch a lot of news in the house, but we always like kind of turn it off when he's around, and he doesn't have access to social media. So honestly, I feel a little lucky in this conversation that he isn't on, that he's not on Twitter or not on yet. He'll have a Twitter account tomorrow, I'm sure. But
Daniel's gonna be fire on Twitter someday.
He's gonna be fire on Twitter. But like, how do you work with yourself to like, I have to say your tips were great, right? About how to like ground myself, but how do you have any tips on how to ground yourself even to become sane in the conversation when you're petrified yourself?
Yeah, I think that's a whole nother presentation, Jamie. But I think that it really comes down to, I think that self-care aspect is huge, and allowing yourself the emotional like space to process through whatever you need to process through before having the conversation with your kids directly. And I think that means like talking to your partners, talking to your friends, like in those like Facebook groups and those community groups, like talking to people in the community groups, like linking into your own community and your networks, and leaning into like, if you're feeling this way, right, like likely you're not the only one feeling this way, and that you're not isolated in this situation. I think it's the reality that probably most parents feel very similarly, especially when they're sending kids to school for the first time. I think it would be questionable if we weren't feeling scared about sending our kids to schools, like given what we've like seen happening in the news over the past several years. And I think accepting that and saying like, and that's kind of where like early on in my presentation when I was talking about like modeling behaviors, like it's okay that this is like scary and uncomfortable and it's not an easy conversation. And I think modeling to our kids, like it's okay that we have emotions and worries and fears about this too. I'm a human just like you, and like mommy does have emotions, right? Like I do feel this way, and it's okay, but this is why I'm talking to you, because I'm worried about it. You might be too.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. And kind of to that point, is there a point at which, is there such a thing as too much preparation, or when we're trying to prepare our kids to know how to react or have some tools that maybe it didn't occur to them to be worried and now they are? And I'm Gen X, so when I was growing up, there was a weird fear of kidnapping. Mm-hmm. I don't know what happened, if there were a couple of really high profile kidnappings, but it was like there were code words. I mean, if you talk to any parent, I think the impression was that at any moment we were going to just get snatched from our yard, right? And so I remember like my mom and I had a code word if some stranger was trying to pick me up at school, and there were the places in the yard where you had to go so you were within sight line. And honestly, it had never occurred to me that I could be kidnapped when I was a little kid, except for these safety measures. Right. So I guess, how do we balance that as caregivers to make sure that we're not overcorrecting, especially when some of these things we can't prevent?
Yeah. And I think this is like follow your kids' lead.
Okay.
Kind of like lean into what they're doing, because I think kids will talk to you. I also think this goes back to like, you know, your kid best, right? Like there are some kids that are just like very anxiously natured and are worriers, and they see something once and then they worry about it and they need that reassurance and the structure. And then there's some kids who like it will never cross their mind, like unless we sat them down at the table and had the conversation. I think in terms of the conversations that we talked about today specifically, like these are definitely conversations, let's have them after a big event happens or after something happens that we know that we've been exposed to. And maybe it's something where like once a year when school starts, or at some point during the year, we kind of say like, hey, I know you do lots of drills at school, like do you have any worries about those? But I would say like on an ongoing basis, are we talking about like violence just to like kind of revisit that fear? Maybe it's not necessary unless the kids are bringing it to the table themselves.
I'm also wondering, is there, presumably proximity is going to cause more stress, trauma, reaction, right? Proximity to the event, both in terms of geography, and then also do you know people involved? But is there sort of a scale, like are there certain types of community violence that generally have a much bigger impact on kids that we need to be more aware of, or is it just sort of all kind of dependent on the event? I don't know if I'm asking that well, but
I think it's dependent on the event. And I think, like you said, it's like dependent on proximity and magnitude, I would say is a big one, especially with like, when I think of things that have impacted kids the most, at least in what I've seen, it like those, like the school shootings, like just like are definitely ones that I think we see like repetitively. And then like other like shooting or violent type activities that kids have experienced or like had a family member involved with. Yeah, and I think those bigger magnitude, the ones that really do get that like the wave of social media attention, I think also just bring about a lot of worry.
Mm-hmm. And I don't want to put you on the spot with a little bit of a more complex question, but we, every child is a foster care agency, and we have kiddos coming to us from really 0 to 21, from all different types of backgrounds and all different types of exposure. And I will say also, that the kids come to us representing all different types of marginalized individuals and groups, some of whom have been subjected to increased risk of violence or increased violence for any number of reasons, whether we're talking about LGBTQ teens or not teens, any child, teens who have been subjected to racially motivated violence. And in some cases, they are coming into a foster home that, as much as we train our foster families, and we have wonderful foster families, it can be really difficult for our foster parents to fully understand, or sometimes even know, what has happened, because of the nature of, when kids come into care, it is often unplanned or an emergency situation. So sort of with that lens, what advice or tips do you have for foster families who may, they have a child who may have either been a victim of violence or may be in a higher risk of being a victim of community violence? How can foster families sort of have that conversation with them, with also keeping an eye towards not wanting to trigger, or intrude, depending on the age of the child either?
So I think it's a fine line, right? And I think when we talk about, and I wish I had the graphic to share with you guys, and I don't have the graphic, and I would search for it for 5 minutes if I was trying to find it. But there's this graphic of like a triangle similar to like the food pyramid or Maslow's hierarchy of needs, if you guys know Maslow's hierarchy of needs. But it places trauma at the very top of the triangle. And similarly to how like Maslow's hierarchy of needs talks about like safety needs first and then relational needs, this triangle talks about like skills that we need to kind of like meet before we're ready to talk about trauma. And I think in reality, when we are working with kids who've experienced trauma, whether it be one traumatic event or complex traumas, or maybe they've experienced many traumatic events, we have to recognize that like kids come to being able to process this in their own time. And I think processing this and talking about this is centered around feeling safe and having trusted relationships. I think it would be unheard of to place a kid in foster care and then expect that suddenly we're comfortable talking about this with our foster parents, because just the fact that we're being placed in a foster home in itself is traumatizing, right? Because we're being removed from where we were living and being placed with strangers who now are there to take care of us, which of course you're ready to take on that role, but that's how terrifying to a child, right? So I think you have to look at it from the lens of like you're redeveloping all of those basic skills, right? Creating that safety, creating the trust, creating like that communication network, and kind of working from the ground up to get to the point where we feel safe having basic day-to-day conversations and just like being able to move through basic tasks first. And I think as parents or as caregivers, that can be very challenging and daunting, knowing that like, wow, this kid has really awful things that they've experienced. And like, I want to know how to help them because I know that they need a lot of support, but sometimes like accepting that we don't have the perfect answers and like aren't ready to have the conversations. And maybe those conversations are best had with counselors or therapists or social workers, unless the kid is really approaching you to talk about the trauma one-on-one, is the best route to go if we're not in a place where we're like actively working through trauma. Does that make sense? And I think that's a whole other conversation in itself too. But I think like really focusing on like we're rebuilding a relationship, right? So if we were establishing a new friendship or like establishing a new like relationship with a partner, like we wouldn't immediately jump into talking about like all of the things of our past. And I think
Mhm.
approaching it similarly in that, like, we have to first just establish the basics and establish the groundwork and like work together to be in that trusting place and like slowly over time evolve to that.
Mhm. Yeah, that makes sense.
Awesome.
Does anyone have any other questions for Amy?
Amy, is it okay to share your PowerPoint with the participants tonight?
Yeah, absolutely.
Perfect. Shelby and Michelle, I'll send it out to you, and Mary, I'll send it out to you.
All right, wonderful.
Awesome.
Well, again, Dr. Amy, I want to say thank you so much for putting
Absolutely.
together such a comprehensive and really thoughtful presentation. It was really helpful. And thanks to NAMI for again sponsoring our Parent Up. And thanks to you, Michelle and Shelby, for attending, and Mary as well. And to Jamie for getting this all set up. I really appreciate all of you being here. I hope it was helpful. Keep an eye out for our November Parent Up, and hopefully we'll see you all then. So thank you so much. Have a wonderful evening, everyone.
Awesome. Thank you all.